Hello, beautiful soul. Before we go any further, just take a breath. A slow, deep, gentle breath. The angels are wrapping their wings around you right now, in this very moment. You are seen, you are held, you are known, and you are so deeply, completely, unconditionally loved. Welcome to Angel's Message for You, a sacred space created just for you, where heaven speaks and souls listen. We are so glad you are here. Now stop scrolling. Put everything else aside, because what you are about to hear today is not meant for everyone. It found its way specifically to you. Out of millions and millions of people going about their day, you landed here at this exact moment, reading these exact words. That is not an accident. That is not a coincidence. That is a miracle. A quiet, beautiful, heaven-arranged miracle. So stay with us all the way until the very end, because what the angels are about to reveal could change the entire course of your life. And they need you to hear all of it. There is a moment approaching in your life so rare, so breathtaking, so full of divine purpose, that your soul has already been quietly sensing it. Even if your mind hasn't fully caught up yet, something is getting ready to happen. Something you will carry in your heart for the rest of your days on this earth. Something that will redefine what love means to you. And the angels sent this message today, at this precise moment, to prepare you to open your heart wide, and to make sure that when this moment arrives, you are fully ready to receive it. The greatest and most beautiful act of love ever prepared for your soul is being prepared right now. For you. Yes, for you. The one who holds a quiet place in the deepest part of your heart. The one whose name comes up in your thoughts more often than you let yourself admit, is no longer holding back. Something has shifted in them. Something profound. Something that no amount of fear, no amount of hesitation, no amount of life's noise can stop anymore. They are being moved not by impulse, not by emotion alone, but by something far greater than either of you fully understands. A force from above is working through them, gently but powerfully, steering every thought, every feeling, every quiet desire, directly toward you. This is not an ordinary moment in time. This is a soul-to-soul offering, one that goes far beyond flowers and sweet words and gestures that the outside world can see. This is about two hearts being pulled together by something the universe itself has been weaving with great care and great intention for a very, very long time. Close your eyes for just a second if you can. Feel that warmth beginning to rise in your chest. That quiet knowing. That soft flutter of something that feels almost too real to be just imagination. That is the angels confirming, yes, this message is for you. Yes, this love is real. Yes, it is coming. And yes, you deserve every bit of it. You may have spent nights, long and quiet nights, wondering whether you were truly worthy of a love this deep. You may have talked yourself out of hope more times than you can even count. You may have worn a brave smile on the outside while quietly, tenderly carrying a longing that felt almost too sacred to speak out loud. The angels see all of that, every single hidden piece of it. They have always seen it, and they want you to know today, right now, without any room for doubt. None of that waiting was wasted. Not a single moment, not a single tear. Every season of silence was preparation. Every moment of doubt was building the strength you will need to fully, openly, joyfully receive what is coming. Heaven has been working behind the scenes of your life, in places your eyes cannot reach, but your soul can feel if you grow still enough. And right now, right in this season you are in, the invisible gears are beginning to turn. Things are shifting, moving, adjusting, aligning in ways that are breathtaking to witness from the heavenly side. The person who is coming toward you with this love is not approaching impulsively or carelessly. This is a decision that has been growing inside them for a long time, maturing quietly, the way something sacred and precious needs the right season to bloom. They have been thinking about you, deeply, consistently, feeling you, carrying the memory of you in the quiet moments of their day when life slows down and only what truly matters rises to the surface. And something inside them, something they cannot fully explain or reason away, keeps returning to you, not out loud, but in the language of the heart, that deep, wordless, unshakable language that only the soul understands. Heaven has been sending them signs, gentle at first, then clearer, then impossible to ignore, and each sign has been landing differently lately, each one arriving a little closer to the center of truth, each one quietly dissolving another layer of whatever fear, hesitation, or uncertainty once stood between them and what their heart truly wants. Because the love they carry for you is no longer content to stay in the quiet corners of their chest. It is pressing outward, demanding expression, demanding to be lived, and they are finally, fully, completely ready to answer that call. What is being prepared for you is not ordinary. Do not picture something small or predictable. Do not let your imagination settle for anything less than what the angels are truly showing. Think of something that will reach the parts of you that have never been reached before. Something that will move through your heart the way light moves through a quiet room in the early morning. Softly, completely, beautifully, changing the quality of everything it touches. This person wants to show you, not just tell you, but truly show you what you mean to them. They want to create a moment you will never forget. A moment that will become one of those sacred memories the soul keeps safe and warm forever. Like a photograph no one else can see but you. And here is the most beautiful part of all. This is not about impressing anyone. This is not for the world to see. This is only for you. Every detail being planned, every thought being poured into this moment. It all has one purpose and one purpose only. To make you feel, in the most real and undeniable way, just how truly, completely, extraordinarily loved you are. There is an invisible thread that has always connected you to this person. It survived time. It survived confusion. It survived the long, quiet, uncertain spaces in between. Even when life seemed to pull you apart, that thread never broke. It just stretched, it held, and now it is pulling back, pulling this person toward you with a kind of spiritual certainty that can no longer be mistaken for anything else. It is no longer a pull they can ignore or redirect. It is a calling, and they are answering. Heaven showed me something about your situation, and I need to speak it to you clearly and directly. What is coming is not fleeting. This is not a moment that will sparkle briefly and then disappear with the morning light. This will be etched into your soul like something permanent, something meant to stay. It will reach the parts of you that you didn't even fully realize were still quietly longing for this kind of love. And when it happens, you won't just feel emotional. You will finally understand deeply, completely, in a way that settles into your bones, that this person sees you, not just the polished version of you, not just what you show the world, your essence, the quiet, tender, real, unguarded parts of you that you rarely let anyone close enough to see. And they choose it all. They choose you, fully, without condition. Maybe your days have felt a little ordinary lately. Maybe your routines feel repetitive, your emotions feel familiar, your life feels a little too still for comfort. But do not mistake that stillness for nothing happening. Because behind the surface of normal, destiny has been quietly, steadily, purposefully moving. Everything that once seemed stuck or directionless or endlessly uncertain has actually been adjusting, gently, precisely, lovingly, to allow this special moment to arrive at exactly the right time. Not a moment too soon, not a moment too late, right on time, heaven's time. The angels want you to know this truth in your whole body, not just your mind. This moment is much closer than you think. And when it comes, it will not be vague or confusing. It will not leave you wondering or second-guessing. It will be clear, powerful, real in the most undeniable way. It will feel like a part of you that has been quietly asleep for far too long is suddenly, beautifully, gently awake. Awakened by something unexpected from someone who is not trying to impress you, but to reach you. To truly, deeply, honestly reach you in the place that matters most. This is the kind of love that does not reveal itself with fanfare. It blooms in the details. It lives in the unexpected moment. The look across a room that lasts a heartbeat longer than it should. The reaching out when they didn't have a reason to. The thoughtfulness that shows up in the smallest things. The kind of thoughtfulness that only comes from someone who has been paying close, loving attention. It shows up in the quiet decisions, the courage it takes to be honest, the willingness to be seen. And your person is making all of those decisions right now, with intention, with care, with a level of thought and feeling that communicates something very important. You are worth doing this the right way. You are worth the courage it takes to step past fear and let love take the lead. The angels have been watching over every moment of your journey. Every quiet night when you wondered if love like this truly existed for someone like you. Every time you almost gave up hope but chose, one more time, to hold on just a little longer. Every prayer whispered in the dark that you weren't even sure anyone could hear. Heaven heard every one. And this moment, the one approaching now, is the answer. This is what all of that patient, faithful, tender holding on has been building toward. You are only a few steps away from experiencing the greatest act of love in your entire life. Let that land. Let yourself actually feel those words. You, the one reading this message right now, are only a few steps away from experiencing the greatest act of love in your entire life. So let me tell you what the angels have revealed about the days ahead. The signs are already beginning to move into your awareness. You may start to notice this person appearing in your thoughts with an almost surprising frequency. Situations that once felt random and unrelated will begin to make a strange, quiet kind of sense. You might hear their name mentioned at an unexpected moment. You might feel a sudden warmth in your chest without knowing exactly what brought it on. You might find yourself smiling in a quiet moment and not fully understanding why. Dreams might feel more vivid, more meaningful. A sense of something approaching, something good, might settle gently over you in the early morning hours before the day fully begins. These are not coincidences. These are the angels whispering to your spirit. Get ready. Open your heart. Something beautiful is coming toward you, and it is already very close. And the truly wonderful thing is this: you will not have to force any of it. You will not have to chase or strategize or try to make something happen that was always going to happen. What is coming will come to you. It will arrive the way an answer arrives, at the exact moment the question has fully matured in your soul. And when it does, everything around it will feel natural. Easy, right? Like something that was always supposed to be exactly this way. This person is not just moving toward you emotionally. They are being spiritually guided toward you. Every step they are taking in your direction is being illuminated from above. Heaven is making sure that nothing gets in the way this time. No room for old doubt to creep back in. No room for fear to win again. No room for this love to stay unlived when it was always meant to be fully, beautifully lived. They have tried, in different seasons of their life, to explain what they feel for you with logic. They have tried to reason it away. They have tried, maybe more than once, to move forward without this. But the soul does not speak in logic. And the answer the soul keeps giving them, quietly, persistently, undeniably, is always the same. You are the right one. You are not replaceable. You are not just a chapter from the past. You are something living inside them that never faded, never disappeared, only grew deeper and more certain with time. This bond between you was not formed by accident. It was built on something real, something that exists below the level of what is convenient or comfortable or easy to explain to others. This is a meeting of two souls that recognized each other. Something in you calling to something in them calling back to you, and that recognition has never fully gone away. No matter how much life happened in between, no matter how much time passed, no matter how many doors seemed to close, your person knows there is something in you they have never found anywhere else. And they are done pretending that isn't true. They are done letting fear be louder than love. They have chosen, from the most honest and courageous place inside themselves, to stop staying distant from something so real, so true, so meant to be lived. And what they are preparing to do for you will require genuine courage. The kind of courage it takes to be truly vulnerable. To allow someone to see all of you, the tender parts, the uncertain parts, the parts you usually keep protected. To walk past pride and past the comfortable safety of keeping your heart hidden. Not everyone ever finds that kind of courage. But this person is stepping into it. For you. Because of you. Because you are worth it to them in a way they cannot explain but can no longer deny. What is being prepared is not coming from obligation. It is not coming from guilt or fear of losing you. It is coming from the deepest, most genuine, most truth-filled place inside this person's heart. A place where love has been quietly alive through every season, quietly waiting, quietly growing stronger even through the times it was not being expressed. And now it is ready to be expressed. Fully, honestly, beautifully. There is one thing the angels want you to hold close before this moment arrives. You do not need to be perfect to receive this love. You do not need to have completely healed every wound or resolved every old story or arrived at this moment without any marks from the journey. Heaven does not require you to be perfect. It only requires you to be willing. Willing to open. Willing to feel. Willing to let something good arrive without immediately bracing for it to be taken away. Because what is coming is not just a love story. It is a healing. The kind of deep, gentle, lasting healing that only truly honest love can bring. The kind that reaches the quiet places inside you where old pain has settled in and made itself at home. Places where promises were made and not kept. Where words were spoken that left marks. Where people who should have stayed chose to leave. This love is coming to reach those places. Not with dramatic declarations or impossible promises, but with steady, daily, honest presence. Not with performance, but with truth. There is a space inside every soul that time alone cannot touch. And your person is being guided by something much bigger than either of them. Realizes in the natural to offer you exactly what was missing. Exactly what you have needed most, in your most honest moments, when the quiet was loud enough to hear your own heart. Care. Presence. A love that actually shows up. A love that stays. You will feel it in the way they look at you, differently than before, with something clearer and warmer in their eyes. You will sense it in the way they speak to you, with a kindness and a tenderness and a realness that feels unlike anything you have experienced with them before. And in that moment, something inside you will shift. Something will soften. Not because you decided to let your guard down, but because this person's presence will create a kind of safety that makes the guard unnecessary. A warmth that says you can rest here, you can be yourself here. You do not have to protect yourself from this. Heaven is orchestrating all of this with extraordinary care. Every detail, every step, every moment of timing. Nothing in this unfolding is being left to chance. And the angels want you to hold this truth in your heart. This is not wishful thinking. This is not a comforting story meant to give you hope today and then dissolve tomorrow. This is real. This is already in motion. And when it arrives, your spirit will recognize it immediately, the way you recognize something that was always meant to be yours. You will not need to question it. You will simply know. This is also, right now, a season for you to prepare your own heart. In the coming days, take care of your energy with intention. Be gentle with yourself in a way you perhaps have not always allowed yourself to be. Spend time in the stillness. Let yourself breathe more deeply. Begin to release whatever you have been carrying that no longer truly belongs to you. Old anger, old disappointment, old stories that told you love this real was not really available for someone like you. Let those things begin to loosen their grip. Not because you must be perfectly healed for love to arrive, but because what is coming needs space to land. Space inside you. A heart that has room for something new. A heart that is open even if still healing. Even if it still carries the tenderness of old wounds. Love does not require an empty vessel. It only requires a willing one. And you are willing. The fact that you are here, reading these words, allowing yourself to feel something, allowing yourself to consider that maybe, just maybe, something this beautiful is truly possible for you, that is proof enough. Something in you never stopped being willing. And that willingness is exactly what heaven has been honoring all along. So let it be enough, because it is more than enough. The angels are saying something specific and clear about the days immediately ahead. Pay close attention to small things. Pay attention to the moments that feel unexpectedly significant, even if you cannot immediately explain why. A conversation that takes a turn you did not see coming. A look that lasts longer than usual. A message that arrives in a quiet moment when you least expected to hear from anyone. A shared memory that surfaces suddenly and fills the present with something warm. A feeling of being thought of, even before you receive any confirmation. These are the breadcrumbs heaven is placing along your path. Follow them. Follow them with trust, not with anxiety. With openness, not with need. Your person is already in motion, already feeling something clarifying inside themselves, already moving through their inner world in a way that is clearing the path to you, one honest moment at a time. Old hesitations are dissolving in the light of what is real. Old defenses are softening. Old fears are losing their grip as something stronger, something truer, takes their place. The walls that were built for protection are coming down, not because someone forced them down, but because the love they feel for you is now stronger than the reason the walls were ever built. And when they reach you, when this moment finally, fully, completely arrives, you will look back on everything that brought you to this point. Every closed door that, at the time, felt like rejection. Every long night when hope felt thin. Every moment when you quietly wondered if heaven had forgotten about you, forgotten about your heart, forgotten about this prayer you have been carrying for so long. And you will understand in a way that goes beyond words. Not one moment was wasted. Not one prayer fell unanswered. Not one tear was meaningless. Everything, every single thing was preparing you. Every fall made your roots deeper. Every season of waiting made your heart more ready. Every wound, every healing, every hard thing you walked through shaped you into exactly the person who is now fully ready to receive this love. You did not give up. Even in the moments when giving up would have been completely understandable, you chose one more day of hope, one more breath of belief, and heaven honored that faithfulness in a way that you are only now beginning to see. Dear soul, this love coming toward you is not the beginning of something fragile or uncertain. This is the beginning of something real, something steady, something that does not disappear the moment life gets complicated or uncomfortable. A connection where trust can genuinely grow, where resting is actually possible, where you can give yourself, your real self, your whole self, without the constant, exhausting vigilance of waiting for it to fall apart. That new beginning is not far away. It is starting now in this very season you are in. And in the days ahead, it will begin to take visible, tangible, undeniable shape. And when it does, beautiful soul, let yourself live it. All the way. Do not pull back at the last moment. Do not let the habit of self-protection rob you of the love you have waited so long for. Do not let the voice of old fear tell you this is too good to be true. What is arriving is not the past repeating itself. It is something entirely, completely new, built on truth, guided by heaven, designed with you at the very center of it. Let yourself be loved, fully, without reservation, without apology, without one foot always ready to leave. You have waited far too long to live halfway. The time to live completely, to love fully and be fully loved in return is now. And the angels, they will be right here beside you, every single step. When you are not sure, they will remind you. When fear tries to speak, they will be the quiet voice underneath that says, "This is real, stay open." When you wake up in the morning wondering if any of this is truly possible, they will be the warmth in your chest that answers, yes. Yes, it is. Heaven's blessing is fully upon you today. Peace is yours. Courage is yours. Clarity is yours. You are never walking this path alone. You are surrounded, completely, lovingly surrounded, by divine love, seen and unseen. And the greatest love story of your life is not something that already passed you by. It is not something meant for someone else. It is not something that exists only in your imagination. It is just ahead of you, and it is coming with everything you have ever truly needed. With infinite love and the full blessing of heaven, your guardian angels are with you, always. Wait, before you go, the angels have one more thing to say, and it may be the most important part of everything shared today. There are things that happened in your past that you have quietly blamed yourself for. Moments where love didn't work out the way you hoped, and somewhere deep inside, a voice decided it must have been your fault. A voice that said maybe you were too much, or maybe not enough, or maybe you simply weren't the kind of person love chooses to stay with. And you carried that belief. You carried it quietly, carefully, the way you carry something fragile that you are afraid to look at too directly. The angels want you to hear this clearly. That voice was wrong. Every single time. You were not too much. You were not too needy or too emotional or too hopeful. You were not the reason love didn't last in the seasons that broke your heart. You were a soul trying to love with everything you had, in circumstances that were not yet ready for you, in seasons where the other person was not yet ready for you, in chapters that were never meant to be your forever, only your preparation. And now the preparation is complete. Everything you lived through, the heartbreaks and the rebuilding, the trust that was broken and the slow, courageous work of learning to trust again, the nights you fell apart and the mornings you got back up. All of it shaped you into someone capable of receiving something you could not have fully held before. A love that is deep requires a heart that has been deepened, and yours has been beautifully, powerfully, undeniably deepened. The angels see who you have become, And what they see is extraordinary. They see someone who knows what it means to love without guarantee. Someone who chose to keep their heart open even after it was hurt. Someone who, in the quiet privacy of their own spirit, kept hoping, kept believing that love this real was still possible, still out there, still somehow meant for them. That kind of courage is rarer than you know. And it is exactly what called this moment into being. Your hope was never naive. It was prophetic. It was your spirit knowing something your mind could not yet see, that what was coming was worth the waiting, that the love being prepared for you was so real, so right, so worth holding out for, that settling for anything less would have been the true loss. And now here you are, on the edge of receiving it. So let the angels speak one more truth over you today. You are not too late. You have not missed your window. The love that heaven has assigned to your soul does not have a cruel expiration date. It does not abandon you because time passed or because life took unexpected turns. It finds you in the right season, at the right moment, with all of the right conditions finally beautifully aligned. That is what is happening right now. Heaven is also asking you to release something specific. The belief that you have to earn this love. The quiet feeling that maybe you need to be better, do more, show up differently, become someone slightly more deserving before love like this can truly belong to you. The angels want you to hear this as directly as possible. You do not have to earn it. You never did. Love is not a reward for perfect behavior. It is not something you graduate into after enough self-improvement. It is a gift, and gifts are given, not earned. You are already enough, exactly as you are, exactly in this moment, with your history and your healing and your questions and your scars and your hope and your tenderness. All of it. Enough. More than enough. And the person coming toward you, the one heaven has been preparing, they are not coming to find a finished, flawless version of you. They are coming to find you, the real, breathing, feeling, imperfectly beautiful you. And when they see you, all of you, they will not want anything changed. They will want exactly this. That is what makes this love different from what came before. It is not conditional. It is not based on you performing or pretending or keeping certain parts of yourself carefully out of sight. It is a love that has room for all of you. A love that actually expands when you are honest, rather than shrinking in the presence of your realness. Let yourself believe that is possible. Because it is not only possible, it is already on its way to you. The angels are also watching over something specific in your energy field right now. There is a softening that has been happening. You may not have named it, but you have felt it. A gentleness toward yourself that has been slowly, quietly growing. A willingness to be kinder in how you speak to yourself in the private conversations of your own mind. A loosening of the grip you once kept on self-criticism and high standards that never left room for grace. That softening is not weakness. It is preparation. It is your spirit making space. Because the love that is coming cannot fully land in a heart that is braced against itself. It needs to find you a little open, a little soft, a little willing to receive without immediately deflecting. And you are getting there. The angels see it clearly. Keep going in that direction. Be gentle with yourself in the days ahead. Speak to yourself the way you would speak to someone you love deeply. Give yourself the same patience you give to others. Extend to your own heart the same compassion you have offered freely to people around you. You deserve that from yourself. And as you practice it, you will notice that receiving it from someone else begins to feel more natural, more possible, more real. This is the work the angels are inviting you into right now. Not the work of fixing yourself or becoming someone new. The work of simply opening, of softening, of saying yes quietly and from the inside to the love that is making its way to you. And the universe will meet your yes with everything it has been holding in readiness. There is also something the angels want to say about faith, because faith is what carried you this far, and it is what will carry you through the days ahead. Not the kind of faith that requires certainty before it shows up. The other kind, the harder, braver, more beautiful kind. The kind that chooses to believe even when the evidence is not yet visible. The kind that says, I don't fully see it yet, but I trust that something real is coming, and I am going to keep my heart open for it. That is the faith you have been practicing. Quietly, consistently, even on the days it did not feel like faith at all. Even on the days it felt more like stubbornness or wishing or simply not knowing what else to do. The angels receive all of it as faith. Every moment you chose hope over despair, every time you decided to believe in love one more day, heaven counted it. Heaven honored it. And heaven is answering it now. So hold on. Not with white knuckles or desperate gripping. Hold on the way you hold something precious, gently, with trust, knowing that what is real cannot be lost. The love that belongs to you cannot be stolen by time or circumstance or the mistakes of the past. It is yours. It has always been yours. And it is finding its way to you now. Take a breath. Feel the angels around you. Feel the warmth of heaven leaning toward you in this moment, speaking these words over your life. You are loved. You are chosen. You are seen in full and wanted completely. And what is coming for you is something beautiful enough to have been worth every single day of the journey to get here. Stay open. Stay soft. Stay hopeful. And when the moment arrives, and it will arrive, receive it with your whole heart. Not with caution. Not with conditions. With your whole, open, beautiful heart. You have waited long enough. Love is coming home, with infinite love and heaven's fullest blessing. Your guardian angels are holding you close today and every day that follows. There is something the angels have been quietly observing in you throughout this entire journey, and it is something they want to celebrate with you today. You kept going. That might sound simple, but the angels know exactly how many times keeping going required everything you had. The mornings you woke up feeling like something important was still missing from your life. The moments you scrolled past other people's happiness and had to work to hold onto the belief that your season was still coming. The times someone asked you how your love life was going and you found a gracious answer while internally hoping, quietly and privately, that something would change soon. The hours you spent in your own company, getting better at being whole by yourself while still hoping, somewhere underneath it all, that wholeness with someone else was still a possibility. The angels saw all of it. Not a single moment escaped their attention. Every quiet wish, every private prayer, every moment of faith you chose when doubt would have been so much easier. And they want you to know that faithfulness mattered. It matters enormously. Because what you were doing all along, even when it did not feel like anything significant, was staying ready. Keeping the door of your heart from closing completely. Leaving just enough room for something real to walk through. And something real is about to walk through. Heaven is making this known to you today because the angels understand something about the human heart that is profoundly important. When we have waited for something a long time, we can sometimes stop believing we are still waiting. We can convince ourselves we have moved on, let go, decided not to want it anymore. And on the surface, life looks fine. Life keeps moving. We function. We smile. We fill our days with good things. But underneath, the heart is still there. Still open. Still quietly, tenderly hoping. That is where you are. And the angels see it. And they are saying to you today, your heart was right to keep hoping. It was always right, because what your heart has been quietly pointing toward is real, is coming, and is closer than any morning of doubt ever made you believe. This is a moment to trust the part of you that never fully gave up. That small, persistent, quietly brave part of you that kept whispering, "There is still something beautiful ahead." That part knew something. It always knew something. And now the rest of your life is about to catch up with what that quiet inner voice has been telling you all along. The angels also want to speak to the fear that might rise up when good things begin to happen. Because for someone who has waited a long time, the arrival of something good can feel almost dangerous. The thought arrives, what if this is just another beginning that leads to another loss? What if I get my hopes up and something goes wrong? What if opening my heart again just means having more to lose? The angels hear those fears. They are not shocked by them. Those fears are the natural result of loving through loss, of hoping through disappointment, of being human and tender and honest about how much being hurt can cost. And the angels are not asking you to pretend those fears do not exist. They are simply asking you to let something exist alongside the fear. Let possibility exist alongside caution. Let hope exist alongside the memory of pain. Let the future exist alongside the past. You can hold all of it at once. You are strong enough for that. And as this love begins to make itself known to you, as the signs grow clearer and the presence of this person grows warmer and more certain, you will find that the fear naturally begins to quiet. Not because someone promised you nothing would ever go wrong, but because the love itself will carry a kind of truth that even fear has to eventually bow to. Truth is stronger than fear, always, and what is coming toward you is the truth. The angels are surrounding you in this moment with something specific, a peace. Not the peace that comes from everything being figured out or resolved or perfectly arranged. The deeper kind, the peace that exists underneath all of it. Underneath the uncertainty and the hoping and the waiting and the wondering. The peace that says, I am held. Something greater than my own understanding is working on my behalf. And I can rest in that. Let yourself rest in it today. Even for just a few minutes. Even just in this moment, reading these words. Let the angels carry what feels heavy. Let heaven hold what is too much for your arms. And trust, genuinely, fully, breathingly trust, that the love being prepared for you is in the most capable hands imaginable. It will arrive in exactly the right way, at exactly the right time, with everything your heart has been reaching for. You are so loved, dear soul, so genuinely, powerfully, divinely loved. Not because of what you have accomplished or who you manage to be on your best days, but simply because you are here, simply because you exist. Simply because heaven knit you together with intention and purpose and love from the very beginning, and that love has never stopped. Carry this message with you into the days ahead. When doubt whispers, return to it. When fear rises, come back to it. When you are not sure whether to believe, let this be the reminder. Heaven spoke this over your life. And what heaven speaks does not return empty. Your greatest love story is not behind you. It is unfolding, right now, in this season, in this life that is yours. And it is going to be more beautiful, more real, more soul-filling than anything you have yet imagined. Receive it, believe it, live it, with all the love of heaven wrapped around you. Your guardian angels are here, always. Amen.